Thank you, President Andrea. Today's speaker is Kurt Paulsen, who is an associate professor of urban planning in the Department of Planning and Landscape Architecture at UW-Madison. Professor Paulsen's teaching and research focuses on housing, affordable housing finance and policy, land use, and municipal finance. He has chaired the City of Middleton Workforce Housing Committee and has consulted for Wisconsin Housing and Economic Development Authority. His published research has appeared in academic journals, and he's most recently the author of Falling Behind, which is about Wisconsin's workforce housing shortage, published recently by the Wisconsin Realtors Association. Today, Professor Paulsen is going to tell us about the current state of affordable housing in the state of Wisconsin and the Madison region. We look forward to his presentation, and as a way of saying thank you, our club has made a contribution to the Rotary International Polio Plus Fund for speaking with us today. I want to remind you that if time allows at the end of the presentation, we will have time for question and answers, but please wait for a microphone to come to you before you ask your question. So please join me now in welcoming Professor Paulsen to the podium.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really honored to be here, especially amongst a lot of friends that we've made over the years and acquaintances in the housing sector. I see a lot of affordable housing developers actually in the room today. And of course, I'm especially nervous to be speaking in front of Mary Wright, who is so distinguished in the field. And as you know, she runs Wisconsin Housing Preservation Corporation, which is one of the leaders nationwide in preservation and development of affordable housing. I also want to say, I think the last time I was at a Rotary meeting, I was in high school. If I remember, you have a program called the Youth Rotor Program, and it was up in Wausau where I grew up. So I remember thinking that was just actually really enjoyable to come to a meeting in the middle of the school day with people who were actually working for a living and making a difference in their community. And the scholarship money was also appreciated. So people do benefit from your scholarship programs, so I guess I'm living proof. So what I want to talk about today is the current state of affordable housing in the Madison and Dane County region, with a little bit on the state of Wisconsin. And what I want to do in the time that we have is I want to briefly stifle your enthusiasm by going to definitions and data. Right? I'm sorry. At some point in time, I'm kind of known as the data guy when it comes to affordable housing policy in the state. And I think the reason that's important is a lot of people have different perceptions about what we mean, and that can lead to a lot of policy confusion or actual conflict. So if we can take some time and kind of agree on some definitions, then we can use the data to tell a story about the scope of the problem. But I'm aware of the fact that what I'm trying to do is tell a story about the state of housing in our region. But I'm aware, as all of you are, and especially those of you who work with clients who need affordable housing, right, Ellen, that we're talking about real people with real needs. And that if you don't have decent, affordable, safe, and healthy housing, a place to lay your head at night, almost everything else in life falls apart. So hopefully we remember the stories of people with lived experience as we're talking about some rather complicated public policy choices that we face as a region. So we want to do some definitions. I want to identify a few key trends and challenges in the Dane County housing market. We're kind of a unique housing market, as you all know, and we face both a number of challenges, but we have a number of really powerful resources to bring to bear, not least of which is the leadership of many people in this room. We're going to talk a little bit about who experiences this housing gap, and then we're going to, at the end, try to talk about some policies and strategies to expand housing options and improve affordability. So if you're interested in doing some more homework and reading, the data for this presentation comes from two reports I recently published. One on the left there you see is from the Realtors Association, and that looks at the affordable and workforce housing trends in the state of Wisconsin. And you can Google Wisconsin workforce housing shortage to find it. And then the one on the right is the one we did for the Dane County Department of Planning and the Dane County Housing Initiative, and that's the particular details on the Dane County housing market. And just by looking at these two report covers, you can see which one had the budget for a graphic designer and which one was me with Microsoft Word. And I will say, of course, as a disclaimer, I've worked with and for many organizations, but everything I'm going to say today is my own opinion. Don't hold the county or the city or the realtors responsible for anything I say. So I'm always looking for different ways to kind of explain why this is such a challenge to think about housing affordability. So I want to talk about the affordability puzzle, which is both supply of units at various prices and then the demand for those units, which comes from households and the income they earn in the labor market, right? And at some level, housing affordability is a simple math question because it's the ratio of the income you earn in the labor market to the price of housing. And sometimes we say that housing is unaffordable because people are not earning enough income. But sometimes it's unaffordable because house prices themselves are pretty high. And what's unique about the Madison market is we have both of those challenges going on at the same time. So whenever you're talking about housing affordability, you have to think about how all of these things go together. Okay, so now we're going to get a little technical, and so hopefully you have your coffee. This is Housing Economics 101. So when we're talking about housing affordability, it's the general trend of housing relative to income in an area. Usually we're talking about the midpoint, so the 50th percentile or the median. And if you ever see national reports about housing affordability from the realtors or from the home builders, this is the concept they're looking at, right? That in the long run, we think that the price of a house or the rent you charge in an apartment should reflect economic fundamentals, right? Cost of construction, interest rates, demographics, and income. But when it does not, then that's a clear indication we might actually have a supply restriction, right? And so the current crisis, both nationally and locally, is really a supply problem, right? That we are not building enough units to keep up with demand, right? And so the way to think about it is this. When your demand for housing goes up in an area, and it's going up in Dane County and across the state, right? People plus jobs plus income is demand for housing, right? Demand is going up. We're the fastest growing county in the state. So if you do not build new units to accommodate new people, then prices go up. And when prices go up, they go up disproportionately on the lower end of the housing market, which puts a disproportionate squeeze on our low and moderate income workers, okay? So that's kind of Housing Economics 101. When we talk about housing affordability in a region, we're talking about the overall supply. And Madison has a housing affordability problem overall. Madison also has a affordable, and this is kind of a key phrase I want us to hold in mind as we think about this. We will never solve our housing crisis without more supply, but more supply alone will never solve our housing crisis. There's always going to be people who have lower incomes and or special needs or disabilities who will never be able to afford a market unit of housing, right? That's not a reason not to build new market rate housing. Because if we don't, then the price goes up and it hurts those at the bottom the worst. But just building new units won't automatically solve all of our housing problems. Madison also has a problem with, in Dane County, with affordable housing. And this is a term that a lot of people use kind of loosely. So I'm going to propose a definition, right? Affordable housing is a unit of housing that is affordable. And what we mean by that is you spend no more than 30% of your income, right? Yeah, I do apologize. Affordable housing, as fascinating as a topic as it is, boils down to a math problem, right? Whether you have enough units at enough price for the households who need it, right? So I know that takes kind of all the jazz out of affordable housing, but it's a math question, right? So a unit is affordable if a particular income household can afford it, right? So the source of affordable housing may be a government program, and we'll talk about some of those. The housing tax credit program, the bond program, vouchers, project-based rental assistance, USDA, public housing, all these government programs that we talk about. A unit can be affordable if it's provided by a nonprofit housing provider, even without government subsidy. Or there is what we call naturally occurring affordable housing, when a unit has kind of filtered down the quality scale enough that it's affordable to a lower income family. So for any community, the gap is the difference between the number of units and the number of people who need those units. And that's a lot of what we talk about in the Dane County report, is what that gap looks like for each of our communities. And one other definition, just to mix up, a lot of people use the term workforce housing, and generally workforce housing includes housing affordability and affordable housing, but it's a different way of talking about what the problem is, right? It's the supply of housing in a community that meets the needs of your workforce, right? And the reason we talk about workforce housing is it emphasizes that most people who need housing are in the workforce, right? And those who aren't in the workforce are usually either seniors or disabled and can't work. And it helps us think about the fact whether a person who works in your community can afford to live in your community, right? So we talk all the time in the city of Middleton about how a starting teacher in the school district or a starting police officer in the police department, about $55,000, right? A starting salary, which is a decent salary, cannot afford to buy even an entry-level house in our city. And that's true of a lot of neighborhoods around the county. Okay, so to bore you even more, here's the data. And I'm just going to, the slides will be available so you can do more study. But oftentimes when we talk about affordable housing, we need to, what's the number we are talking about? So I'm just going to highlight one family here as a prototype. One of the problems with Dane County, it's not a problem, it's an opportunity and a challenge, is that we are a high-income county. And what that means is that the median income, the middle income, for a family of 4 people is $100,000, right? And that reflects the high income in our county, which is a good problem to have. But what it means is that because we have such a high income level, the price of housing is high, so that a family that makes, for example, $48,000 and has 2 people, which might be 2 lower wage workers or a kind of middle income worker, 1 adult with 1 child, would be considered at the 60% level, which would mean that they're eligible actually for a lot of the subsidized housing programs. Part of the difficulty of this income band in Dane County is that if you are making between $30,000 and $60,000, depending on your family size, you are low income and unable to find a decent quality place to live, even though that income in other parts of the country would be more than adequate to find a decent place to live. And if you convert that to a house that you can afford to purchase, that same family could afford to buy a house that costs $162,000. And I don't know about you, but there's not a lot of even entry-level housing in Dane County that costs $162,000. So, and again, this is just to tell a story, and the data is to help us all as leaders to talk about what the challenge is in our market. And so if you want to just look at the far right, average annual percent change in Dane County, we are growing. We are adding population and households at about 1.3% a year, all right? So Dane County's kind of a Goldilocks story. Not super fast, but not decline or slow, right? We're adding 1.3% people per year. We're adding 1.7% jobs per year. So jobs are growing faster than households. But most importantly, if you see the next line, housing units are only growing at 1.1% a year. This is our fundamental challenge. We're adding jobs faster than the state. We're adding population faster than the state. And we're adding housing units faster than the state average. But the rate at which we're adding housing units is not keeping up with population growth or with job growth, right? So it's kind of a mixed story that's kind of both a success, we're building lots of units, just look around, right? But it's still hard to imagine that we are not building enough to keep up with our population demand and growth. And one of the things that means is that rents are rising faster than incomes, right? And so if rents are rising faster than incomes, for our low and moderate income workers, they're getting squeezed, right? Because the rent eats first, so any paycheck increase you do get goes first to rent. What this also means, we have over 100,000 workers who live outside of Dane County who commute in here for work. And I've talked to realtors, I've talked to employers, and they have people who are moving here for jobs, and they're buying houses in Greene County or Jefferson County or down in Rock County, and driving 45 to 60 minutes, right? So if you don't build enough housing near jobs, people have to live further away, or they have to pay too much of their income in rent and housing. And what this means is, going forward, if we continue to grow jobs faster than housing units, more and more people are going to have to live outside of the county and drive in. Anyone think we have a traffic challenge, right? I mean, it's kind of simple economics, right? You have to either build housing near where the jobs are so that people can get there, or the housing has to be located near public transportation, or people are going to live further away and drive everywhere. Okay, so, and again, this slide is from the Realtors Report. It's just to tell a main story, that this difference between households we're adding, people, and housing units we're producing, in Dane County, we've underproduced 11,000 units in the last 11 years. That's about 1,000 units a year. And that's more than half of the state deficit, right? So again, it's a complicated story. Dane County's adding more people and more households and more jobs than any other county in the state, right? We kind of wish the people in the building just across the street would realize that, right? But we're still not adding enough to fully accommodate our demand. And what that means is prices are going up, or people are satisficing by living much further away. There was a headline in Madison.com a few weeks ago about affordable housing, affordable homes for sale in the Madison region. So I'm like, oh, that's a cool article. I wanted to look, and it was like Barneveld, Beaver Dam, Columbus, right? And that's what we're seeing, is workers are driving further. Those of you who are employers, you know what that means, all right? Especially if you have shift work or inconsistent schedules, or you have people who are living further away from jobs. And what does that mean? If their car breaks down or there's this thing called snow, it's difficult to get your workers there on time. And so fixing this transportation, housing, spatial mismatch is one of the biggest challenges we face. Okay, so for the state of Wisconsin, this is true of Dane County as well. This is housing production in the state. So the orange line is single-family permits, and the blue line is lots that are created by subdivision, and then the green line underneath is multifamily building units. And you can see that we used to, in this state, build in a normal market from 94 to about 2004. We used to build a robust number of housing units in this state and create lots, meaning buildable lots that you can build a house on. Obviously, like every place else in the country, production fell way off during the recession. But the most important thing of this slide is it has not yet picked up. So in per capita terms as a state, we're down more than 50% of what's a normal market in terms of housing production, right? And what this means is that you're seeing the housing supply gap cause affordability problems, even in traditionally affordable markets like Eau Claire and Green Bay, right? And it's even worse, of course, in the Madison market, which never saw our prices really decline when they did in the rest of the state. So one way to think about affordability is the price-to-income ratio, right? So economists have always said for years that a good price-to-income ratio is about 3, right? So that if your income is $50,000, a house that's affordable is about $150,000. And that's been a kind of a standard way of looking at housing prices across the nation and across time. And this is data from the Joint Center for Housing Studies. And the blue line, which maybe you can't see as well, is in Madison, that up until about the year 2000, we were under that affordability level. We had house price ratios below 3. But now they're above 3.5, right? And they've continued to go up even as the economy has recovered. What that means is that house prices in Wisconsin and in Dane County have increased 18% in the last 3 years, or 26% in the past 5 years. And I don't know about you, but most people's income has not gone up 18% in the last 3 years. Okay, so I'm going to skip through some of these slides here. One of the things I do in the statewide report is I calculate this index, which is whether a middle-income family using an affordable low down payment product like an FHA loan can afford to purchase the middle-priced house. And as you see here, Dane County is one of the 4 counties shaded dark brown, which means it's not affordable, right? What this means is our middle income workers can't even afford to buy the middle priced home, even with an affordability product like an FHA low down payment loan. That means we have an overall affordability challenge, and you all know this. There's no real entry-level housing for first-time home buyers and moderate income workers. And again, we're not talking about necessarily people working retail or in the service sector, but we're talking about entry-level professionals or those kind of first-time home buyers that many of us were able to purchase back when we started out. So on rent, Dane County just barely is affordable on the same sort of index. And that sounds strange. But the truth is, if you're a middle-income household in Dane County, you're doing okay. You can afford to find a reasonably decent quality rental unit somewhere within your price range. Maybe not the most ideal location, but you can afford to buy it. Where we really see the problem in Dane County is because we've had a surge of rental demand, right? Epic and other sorts of higher income, younger people who are entering the rental market. We've built a lot of units, and the prices have not risen overall, but the number of units that are kind of lower cost units that are available and affordable for our more modest income workers have rapidly disappeared from the stock. Okay? So again, it's that same idea that if you're not building enough units, the squeeze really affects workers on the bottom. This is data from MG&E, which we're very fortunate. I saw the MG&E president here, right? So thank you for your data. They're very good at tracking rental housing supply and vacancy rates. And the blue line is the number of units we've produced, and then the orange or green line there is the vacancy rate. And one of the things that we know is in our central urban markets, we've built a lot of units, but we've still not seen that vacancy rate climb up, right? Because we have all this pent-up demand for rental and rental housing units. So the story I'm telling is a bit ambiguous, right? Because everybody looks around and they see that we're building lots of stuff everywhere. And the good news is that has stopped our prices from going up too fast. Think California, right? But it has not even been adequate enough to provide for the full range of housing that we need. And I'll talk a little bit later about some forecasts going for the next 20 years, and those numbers will kind of make your head explode when you think about the challenge we face as a growing region. So one of the things I do in the report, and again, you can't see all the numbers, but I wanted to show you the details, is when we talk about housing the workforce in Dane County, I look at in the report those occupations that have more than 1,000 employees and that have the lowest wages, right? And so you can see that this includes cashiers, retail workers, home health aides, preschool teachers, people in kind of service industry jobs in food preparation, serving, right? This is 80,000 workers in our county. This is about 28% of our workforce. Right? This is the vital workforce, because if they disappeared from our county, the entire economy would crash, right? And this includes housekeepers and security guards and bank tellers. And of course, the highest prevalence occupation in this category is retail sales, right? So what does this mean? This means that overall of these workers, if you took their kind of average wage, they earn about $26,000 a year. These are people in the workforce, the vital workforce for our county, who earn $26,000 a year, right? And oftentimes they can't afford to live anywhere near where they work, because I don't know about you, but there's very few apartments available for rent at $667 anywhere in this region, right? So when we talk about the relationship between affordability and affordable housing, we're talking about the vital workforce that is in the workforce. That's why we call it workforce housing. We're trying to dispel myths, right? These are people who are working full-time jobs, and the income they earn is not adequate to afford even a reasonably decent place to live anywhere near where they work or in a neighborhood or school district that they might have reason to want to live in. And this becomes our biggest challenge, right? Is that the numbers, when you look at it as a county, are really quite staggering. So one of the things we do in the report is we talk about what's happened in the last time period, kind of during the recession and then post the recession. And one of the things you notice is that it's a strange story as well. For our lower income renting households, this chart is the number that are what we call extremely cost burden. And again, I'm sorry, that's a lot of technical terms in math. That means you're paying more than 50% of your income to rent, right? I don't know about you, but if you have to pay 50% of your income to rent, that does not leave much left over for transportation, healthcare, school supplies, food, medicines, right? So these are the most vulnerable, most squeezed households in our county. And again, these are numbers, but we want to put names and faces to these people. In Dane County, in the last post-recession period, the number of these renters has gone up. So that if you want kind of an overall number, the number is about 15,000. So we have 15,000 renters. That's households, right? So that could be 30,000 people or more. 15,000 households who rent, whose income is less than half of the median, and who pay half of that income to rent. Right? So this is the most vulnerable people in our workforce. These are the people who are maybe one paycheck away from experiencing housing insecurity. Or if their older car breaks down and they can't make it to work, they might miss some hours. And then if you miss some hours, you can't pay the rent. And therefore, as rents are going up, the landlord might evict you, right? So this is the scope of the challenge. Now, over time, this percentage has gone down slightly. So I always include this slide as a way of thinking. Have we made progress in Dane County, right? As a percentage of all renters, it's gone down about 1.4%, from 68% to 67%, which kind of feels like, right, you're maybe bailing out a ship with a cup of water. It's not insignificant, though, because in this time period, if we had the same rate of cost burden, 1,000 additional households would have been in extreme burden. And if you look during that time, 1,000 affordable units is approximately what the city of Madison and Dane County, through their affordable housing development funds, were able to produce. So the lesson is both that if we make a concerted effort as a region to invest in affordable housing, we can reduce some of the severe cost burdens on our fellow citizens and workers. And we should, right? But the numbers are large enough that we have to realize that at this rate, it might take us 20 or 30 years just to solve our challenges. And so we have to think creatively as a region about how to be even more aggressive and more responsive to those needs. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't point out the obvious fact that in Dane County, the burden of housing costs and housing affordability is not equally distributed according to race, right? And any conversation about our housing challenges must address racial equity head on. And what this chart shows is that even controlling for the same income levels, African American and Latinos of the same income level have a much higher rate of housing cost burden, right? And that represents a whole host of legacies and policies, both nationally and locally, that really propose a disproportionate racial burden in housing, right? And one of the things I talk about in the statewide report is that Wisconsin has the same challenge, which is that home ownership rates for African Americans in Wisconsin had the highest rate of decline of any ethnic group, right? So during the 2007 to 2017 period, that we are actually the 6th worst state in the nation for that black-white home ownership gap, right? And these numbers can be overwhelming, but I think as a state, what we need to do is actually step back and kind of have moral outrage at this fact, right? That the African American home ownership rate in Wisconsin was already too low in 2007, right, at 28%, right? But the national homeownership rate for African Americans today is lower than it was in 1968 when we passed the Fair Housing Act, right? But Wisconsin was already way worse than that. So we're the 6th worst in the nation. So even when we're talking about housing affordability overall, affordable housing, we have to recognize the fact that this burden is disproportionately borne by some in our community. And Wisconsin leads the Midwest in terms of the percentage of renters who are extremely cost burdened, right? So as a state, we have a challenge. As a city, we have a challenge. As a county, we have a challenge. So in the remaining few minutes that I have, which I spent more time diagnosing the problem than solving it. It's a classic case, right? We're going to talk about some of the strategies we can have to address this current gap. And let me just say, one of the reasons I spent so much time on the data and the definitions is that you all are community leaders, business leaders, and really this is information we hope that you will take to your communities, to your elected officials, to the people in the legislature, to the business community, and say, we have a real challenge. What can we do to really work together to try to solve it? And the city of Madison and Dane County have been leaders recognized nationwide in affordable housing, okay? So we do need to celebrate what we have been doing. Here's the numbers that are supposed to make your eyes pop out of your head. Someone asked me this the other day, and I said, I'm going to run a forecast model, right? Nothing like forecast model at lunch to really get your juices going, right? Between now and 2040, Dane County needs to produce somewhere between 53,000 and 59,000 new housing units, which really works out to about 2,500 to 3,000 a year, of which 600 to 1,000 need to be affordable. And what this means is, basically, if we keep the kind of gangbuster production that we saw in 2014, 2015, and 2016 in Madison and Dane County, which everyone thought was extreme, right? We need to keep that level of production going consistently for the next 20 years, including the percentage that is affordable, just to meet the gap that is expected to be produced in the next 20 years. Not even to necessarily turn the curve, right? So the big question for us as a region, I think, that I'll leave you with as we're running out of time, where are we going to build 55,000 new housing units? If every new housing unit, if every community, if every neighborhood says, well, we're full, you can't build anything more here, right? Right? I mean, as I like to tell my students, cities either grow out or they grow up, right? Double meaning. If all of those housing units are at standard suburban densities, which on net consume about 10,000 square feet per lot, right, with roads and all that, that's 13,500 acres consumed of new development, which is about 21 square miles. So the challenge we face as a region is that we have lots of great neighborhoods, already developed cities, right? Madison, Fitchburg, Monona, Middleton, Sun Prairie. But we're growing. If we do not find a way to accommodate 55,000 new housing units in the next 20 years, then all of the trends I've identified in terms of affordable housing and all the investments we make on tax credits and bonds to subsidize affordable housing will really not make much of a difference, because the house prices will continue to go up so high that housing will continue to be unaffordable. So a lot of the solutions that I talk about in the reports are based on the idea of building more housing at higher densities with kind of innovative design to allow more flexible, interesting housing styles and types in existing and new neighborhoods. So a lot of what we talk about is what's called the missing middle, which is this idea of housing units we used to build, which are duplexes, townhomes, condos, bungalow courts, townhouses, and small multifamily, right? Obviously, in both the city of Madison and some of the other outlying areas, we're going to need to build higher density multifamily units on transit lines, right, with lower parking requirements so that people can afford to live there and get to jobs on transportation. Because the other thing is if we build these 55,000 units further out where there's no transit, can you imagine the Beltline traffic at 8:15 in the morning? And I'm running out of time, so a lot of what we talk about in the report is smaller lots, reduced parking requirements, multifamily developments, all sorts of financing tools that cities and towns and villages can use in partnership with the state. And then I just have lots of examples. I'll just end with this one. This is in Monona, which is really interesting. There was one large house, older house on a large lot, and they were able to tear it down and build 6 housing units, which, again, each of these units is selling for like $380,000. So small houses on small lots is still meeting a demand that we have in the market that we're not providing. And this is a way to do what we call gentle density or incremental density that doesn't necessarily alter the quality of established neighborhoods, but goes a long way towards providing options and increasing affordability in the region. So I could go on all day, but thank you.
I heard you speak on one previous occasion where you talked about the parking requirements.
Yes.
In fact, you talked about building multifamily dwellings in the central city with no parking whatsoever. And the way in which that might encourage greater density and keep prices down and require more.
So I see a lot of developers around here, and they probably all know that number, that a structured parking stall for a multifamily development is somewhere between $35,000 to $40,000 per stall. Right, so amortize that over 20 years, that's a couple $100 a month in rent that we're in essence forcing people to pay by mandating minimum parking. So my own view is that cities should, particularly near transit stations, and this connects with Mayor Satya's proposal for bus rapid transit and transit-oriented development, is that if you build a unit near a transit station, we should allow like no parking requirements if someone wants to be able to live there cheaper and be able to take the bus everywhere. Right? So that's one of the ways that you can knock a couple $100 off the rent of any apartment any year, is just not require parking. Now, as you know, in most neighborhoods, if you say we're going to build an apartment complex and not put any parking in, the neighbors are all worried that people are going to park on the street. To which I say, well, that's what streets are for. They're for parking. If there's too many people who want to park on the street, charge a parking fee, right? I mean, we want to make a city where if you want to live here without a car, you ought to be able to live here without a car. I mean, it both fights climate change and improves affordability.
Great data, thank you. One more question. How does all your data take into account how people live? And there's multi-generation homes, people not wanting moving out of their home into people living longer, and also people in the ages in the early 20s. When I was in the early 20s, I had a roommate. Now they're working in Epic, they're making $90,000. They're not. So how does that take into effect your data and then learning how people live?
Right. So it's kind of embedded in the data that there's different household sizes and stages of the life cycle, and people may want to be able to double up, but a lot of zoning ordinances would prohibit you from building multi-generational housing that would allow, they're called granny flats or accessory dwelling units. So you might have one of your kids live there, or maybe your mother-in-law live there, right? And a lot of the constraints are, why not let people build the type of housing that is flexible enough that if 8 young people want to kind of live together in a kind of co-housing situation and save money on the rent, that they can do that. So it's embedded within that is that you want to match household size and income to the housing type. And one of the things we don't do well is we don't provide a wide variety of housing. It's usually the single family detached, which is only a nuclear family, or it's the kind of 2-bedroom multifamily tower. So let's build lots of really interesting, flexible, in-between sort of housing and let people kind of sort according to their own market demands. And I'm getting the signal.
Thank you, Professor Paulsen, for that presentation. I want to remind Rotarians, turn in your song survey at the button box as you leave, and we are adjourned.